It's also been brought to my attention that this building in which we were holding the seminar was at least partially funded by the Marconi Society. Eight of the major contributors to the building are Marconi Fellows. So it turns out that we do more than just spread education. It's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Turns out it's also a really hard job because our keynote speaker speaks in so many places and has been introduced so many times that it's impossible to be creative in coming up with describing her. So she has been described by Politico as dynamic. The Silicon Valley Game Changers has turned her into a game changer. So I've really struggled to come up with a way of describing our speaker. She is uncompromising and fearless in talking about the things that we are most interested in. She has strong opinions about net neutrality. She has expressed her judgment about a wireless spectrum, spectral efficiency, where are you, Jessica? Oh, there you are. Unlicensed spectrum. All of these issues have been exposed by our speaker, and as I said before, in an uncompromising and fearless way. We really are honored and so much pleased by having as our keynote speaker, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel.
Thank you so much, Marty, for that really, really kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to speak here today at the Marconi Society. I know that the Society is marking its 50th anniversary this year, so the chance to be here is a tremendous honor. I also want to offer my congratulations to Stanford University professor Paul Raj, and first row resident down there, for winning this year's Marconi Prize. Your remarkable insight that using arrays rather than a single antenna, and that it can increase data rates while also improving coverage, has led to the development of MIMO technology. That's a big deal. Of course, the Marconi Society has been celebrating leading lights in communications like Professor Paul Raj for decades. So, taking a page from your work, I thought I would start by mentioning a few visionaries who have revolutionized how we communicate. Let's begin, appropriately I would add, with your namesake. Guillermo Marconi was toiling away in obscurity in his workshop in Italy in the 1890s. But one day he emerged with the wireless telegraph and the world's first working radio. That radio eventually sent signals across the Atlantic, and worldwide communications has never been the same. Fast forward to the 1940s, it's the height of World War II. Torpedoes were state-of-the-art weaponry, but they were controlled by radios operating only on one channel. So their systems were vulnerable to signal jamming by our enemies, and one creative thinker patented a method to have a transmission hop from frequency to frequency, avoiding jamming or other interference. This spread spectrum technology is now the foundation of so many of our wireless technologies, from CDMA to Wi-Fi to Bluetooth. And the clever mind who came up with this idea? Not some strapping student in a university or researcher in a military institution. It was a brilliant young woman named Hedwig Kiesler, but you probably know her as the actress Hedy Lamarr. Now, 30 years later, we're in the thick of the 1970s. The Sting and American Graffiti are in the theaters. Tony Orlando and Dawn are on the radio, and our friend Marty Cooper is on the street in New York. He holds a clunky 10-inch brick-like device that cost a whopping $4,000. but the device was the first handheld mobile phone, and he did something big. He made a call. That call went through, and the rest is history. 4 decades later, we have more than 7 billion mobile devices around the world. By any measure, that's a lot. But we are just getting started, because mobile data traffic is expected to grow over the next 5 years by 11 times. By the end of the decade, we will be deep in the Internet of Things, with 50 billion machine-to-machine devices communicating wirelessly worldwide. So look at what Marty's one call brought. The world has gone wireless. So I have some ideas I want to share with you today about the wireless future. They are not on par with the ideas of your namesake, the mother of Wi-Fi, or the father of the cell phone. But here are some ideas for the future of wireless communications policy in Washington that could have big impact. 5 ideas for the next 5 years, 5 ideas for the road to 5G. The first idea, spectrum use will become more efficient if we challenge ourselves. Spectrum is the consummate scarce resource. We are not making more. So if we continue to cram more wireless devices into our pockets and purses and more services into our skies, we are going to need to find new ways to promote spectrum efficiency. That means supporting technologies from dynamic spectrum access to frequency-agile radios to smart antenna systems that make this all possible. Now that's easier said than done. So I want to offer an idea building on the thoughts that I first heard from Marty himself. It goes like this. What if we issued a challenge in Washington? Think of it as Race to the Top, Spectrum Edition. Imagine that we decided to reward the first person who finds a way to make spectrum use below 5 gigahertz 50 or 100 times more efficient over the next decade. The reward could be something simple, say 10 megahertz of broadband suitable for mobile broadband use. That's no small prize, because if the winner can find a way to use spectrum 50 or 100 times more efficiently, that 10 megahertz of spectrum could do the work of 500 or 1,000 megahertz of spectrum using today's technology. And think of the power of that kind of prize. We could all benefit from the winning idea when it is introduced at scale, but for that one winner, there'll be any number of near misses. And we could see all across the board, throughout the wireless economy, the multiplied benefit of all of these efforts together. I think a contest like this could generate some real interest. Maybe some of you in this room could be interested. And maybe some of you saw the editorial that Marty and I had in the San Jose Mercury News discussing this idea just last week. It's not something that the FCC can do on its own, but I think it is one of those big, bold, and slightly strange ideas that's worth a look. Second idea. Clearing more federal spectrum will be slow-going unless we provide federal authorities with incentives to relocate. In the United States, federal authorities have substantial spectrum assignments. That's because critical missions throughout the government are dependent on access to our airwaves. Federal authorities use their spectrum assignments to protect us from attack with tools like precision-guided munitions and early missile warning systems. They use them to manage our air traffic, enhance our crop productivity, protect us from forest fires, and help predict weather patterns. These activities are essential to our economic security and national well-being. But we can't be blind to the great interest in commercial wireless demand. The increases are big. And commercial wireless activity has been such a powerful force in our economy, we need to find some spectrum for it to grow. So, we're on a hunt to find new opportunities to fill our spectrum pipeline. We're looking for new ways to take federal airwaves and repurpose them for commercial use. But let me submit to you that our traditional process for doing this is pretty creaky. It's based on sticks. We take a stick and we knock on the door of federal authorities with spectrum assignments. Then we urge, coax, and cajole them to provide us with a bit of airwaves for the commercial sector. And it takes time, but after pressing and prodding, they often offer us a bit. Then we relocate the federal users and eventually get around to auctioning their old airwaves for new mobile broadband use. This is a slow way to go when the wireless world is moving fast. It is not the steady spectrum pipeline our mobile economy needs. That's why it's time for a federal spectrum policy that is based on carrots and not sticks. We need to develop a series of incentives to serve as the catalyst for freeing more federal spectrum for commercial use. We need to find ways to reward federal authorities for efficient use of their spectrum so that they see benefit in commercial reallocation and not just loss. And as part of this effort, I think we should consider evaluation of all spectrum used by federal authorities to provide a consistent way to reward efficiency. In addition, we should look at existing laws to see what other adjustments can make this process smoother. For instance, we could look at the Miscellaneous Receipts Act, which sounds terribly random. But this little law can prevent negotiations between federal agencies and winning bidders in wireless auctions. That means it's up to the FCC to clear spectrum every time for the lowest common denominator. But if we made some changes to this law, we could speed transition to commercial use by allowing winning bidders to negotiate directly with federal authorities being relocated. That could speed repurposing of our airwaves and also provide commercial opportunities to update some federal systems that could be past their prime. Third idea. We will need to look low and high to find spectrum for next-generation wireless networks. Today, the bulk of our wireless networks are built on spectrum ranging from 600 megahertz to about 3 gigahertz. That's the sweet spot for mobile communications. But the sweet spot in the future could look different, very different. We're moving from networks designed for analog voice to networks designed for high-speed data. To keep up with escalating demand, our next-generation networks are going to have to do some heavy lifting. They'll need to accommodate more traffic coming from more devices at higher rates. At the same time, they're going to need to lower latency and conserve battery power to extend battery life. Well, that sounds easy, right? So how are we going to meet those demands? We need to think differently. We can no longer limit ourselves to frequencies in that sweet spot, in that traditional range. We're going to have to look elsewhere. The only question is where. First, we need to look low. We should explore if spectrum in the 400 megahertz range can be repurposed for mobile broadband use. That's not going to come overnight because this band is segmented into many, many, many small parts, but I still think we should explore. Second, I think we need to look high, very, very high. Let's bust through our old 3 gigahertz ceiling. Let's take a look at millimeter wave spectrum all the way up to the 60 gigahertz range and maybe all the way up to 90 gigahertz. At these ranges, we can aggregate spectrum and allow data-intensive applications to ride across hundreds of megahertz at a time. Of course, these stratospheric frequencies mean more than just wide channels. The physics are different. That means propagation challenges, but also new opportunities to think about 5G network topology. Because if you mix those wide channels with small cells packed close together, you can densify networks at low cost. And you combine that with networks using lower band spectrum, and we can deliver service further into buildings and offer faster speeds than ever before, especially in urban areas with the greatest traffic demands. So to look low and look high like this will require thinking through some novel technical and policy issues, but we need to get started. And if we get them right, we will have more resources to play with as we move to next generation networks. Fourth idea, we need more Wi-Fi. We talk a lot in Washington about the growing demands on our airwaves, Most of this talk is centered on licensed spectrum, but it's time to give unlicensed spectrum its due. That's because the spectrum that powers Wi-Fi and a slew of our daily activities is also getting more crowded. But it's more than that. Let's recognize that unlicensed spectrum contributes roughly $140 billion annually to the US economy. That's a lot. On top of that, roughly 1/2 of data connections in this country are now offloaded from licensed spectrum onto unlicensed spectrum. So it may not be intuitive, but that means unlicensed spectrum helps support the value of licensed spectrum. So let's leave behind the tired notion that we face a choice between licensed and unlicensed airwaves. Good spectrum policy requires both. That's why I think we need a game plan for unlicensed spectrum. Unlicensed spectrum should no longer be an afterthought cobbled together from junk bands and stray scraps of spectrum. And you can look up the history at the FCC, and that's how we put it together. It deserves attention up front and in policy prime time. So let me sketch out what an unlicensed game plan looks like. It takes high band, mid band, and low band spectrum. High band spectrum provides the large channels for high definition video at short distances, so think streaming video from your laptop to your television. Mid-band spectrum sacrifices some of that for throughput, but it gives you further reach. And of course, that's where the bulk of our unlicensed spectrum is in the 2.4 gigahertz band. But low-band spectrum can go far and wide, and the result is ideal for larger scale Wi-Fi deployments and machine-to-machine communications. And just this week, the FCC asked for comment on proposed technical rules for low-band Wi-Fi in the 600 megahertz band. So I hope you can take a look, because I think it's important, and I think you can help us get it right. And if we do, I think we can do some big things, because it's time to move beyond the old dichotomies that pit licensed versus unlicensed spectrum, because across the board, we need to choose efficiency over inefficiency and speed over congestion, and more Wi-Fi can be a part of helping us do just that. All right, fifth and final idea, and this is slightly outside of my jurisdiction, but I'm putting it in anyway. The next mobile evolution needs a battery revolution. We're looking forward to a world with more mobile devices than people on Earth. Imagine smartphones multiplying, processing more data with bigger and brighter screens and many more functions. But it's so much more than those devices, because sensors that send information wirelessly will soon be appended to countless common devices and so many of our machines. What we drive, where we live, and what we wear will be capable of communicating wirelessly, keeping us in contact, improving efficiency, reducing cost, and organizing so much more of our daily lives. But this brave new world of ubiquitous connection depends on a revolution in battery technology. Because I don't know about you, but I am already struggling with keeping it all plugged in, living a life where you are always charging. It takes planning, cords, and a non-stop search for sockets. If we don't fix this, battery life will be the new bottleneck slowing our data flows. Still, it won't be easy. That's because developments in battery performance will never move at the pace of Moore's law, and they're going to trail developments in spectral efficiency. Chemical science is different, and we may have reached the limit of what we can drag out of the lithium-ion batteries that power most of our devices today. Still, research is being done. New chemical avenues are under investigation. Novel ways to charge without outlets are being deployed. Researchers are looking at ways that our network design and antennas can make small changes that can help maximize existing battery life. But for my part, I want to issue an invitation. If you see any way that the FCC can use its policies or position to help spur developments in battery science, please let us know. Because the mobile economy is moving fast, and we want to find new ways to power it along. So there you have it. 5 ideas for the wireless road ahead, 5 ideas to keep the communications conversation moving. I think it's important to develop new ideas, not just in research laboratories, but right here in Washington. Because if icons like those honored by the Marconi Society teach us anything, it's that coming up with what is new can be hard, but the payoff can be huge. Better communications policies and better communications technologies can make all of us more connected, grow our economy, and enhance our commercial and civic lives. I think that's good stuff, and I think it's worth fighting for here in Washington and across the country. So thank you.
That was fantastic. You never let me down. Thank you so much, Commissioner Rosenworcel, for that fantastic speech. Was she good or not? I left out the adjective wonderful, and that's what I think about Commissioner Rosenworcel.